Hello friends, welcome back to another Adventures episode. On Friday, August 24, 2001, at 12:52 a.m., Transat Flight 236 departed Toronto Pearson International Airport for Lisbon, Portugal. It was a 7-hour flight, carrying 293 passengers and 13 crew members. 48-year-old Captain Robert Pish, with 16,800 flight hours, including 796 on the Airbus A330, and 28-year-old First Officer Dirk de Jager, with 4,800 flight hours, including 386 on the Airbus A330, piloted the flight. The Airbus 330 was the state-of-the-art model of that time, which was only 2 years old. The aircraft carried 47 tons of fuel when it departed the Toronto gate. After completing all the flight checks, they took off. The pilot steered the plane across the Atlantic Ocean towards Lisbon. It was midnight and the aircraft was cruising at an altitude of 39,000 feet. It was just like any other typical day, routine flight. The crew was comparing their position and fuel consumption with their flight plan every 30 minutes while flying across the Atlantic Ocean. Pilots can monitor fuel by keeping a check on the amount in the tanks compared to the amount when the flight began. At 5:03, which is more than 4 hours into the flight, the pilots noticed the temperature of the oil is low and the pressure was high on engine number 2, which is the right engine. The pilots were seeing this kind of error for the first time in their careers. Normally, as the aircraft operates, the oil temperature increases with time. The pilots had no reason to believe that the fuel leak was the cause of these readings, even though it was an indirect effect. As a result, Captain Pish thought the alerts were fictitious and relayed this suspicion to the Air Transat Maintenance Control Center in Montreal. Unfortunately, the maintenance unit was also unaware of this error. They advised the pilots to keep monitoring the error. They continued their journey. But, after half an hour the pilots received a warning. This time it wasn't related to oil temperature but related to fuel. Most of the commercial flights has large tanks in the wings of the plane equally dividing the fuel. In this case the Flight 236 didn't have the same amount of fuel in both the wings. The quantity of the fuel in the right wing was less than that of left. The pilots knew it's not a major issue and can be resolved during the flight itself. The captain opened the crossfeed valve as suggested in the flight manual. Fuel started flowing from one wing to another. Within minutes it has equal fuel in both the wings. At this time the Flight 236 is midway over the Atlantic Ocean at 39,000 feet. The nearest land is at least 300 kilometers away, that is Lodge's Air Base. Just 10 minutes later the captain started receiving a low fuel warning. At that point, the captain has realized that there is a leak in the right wing or the computers have malfunctioned. The captain also realized that, if the computer is right, they are in serious trouble, because with the fuel left, they cannot turn around or make it to Lisbon. The captain contacts the Santa Maria Oceanic Air Traffic Control and declares a fuel emergency. The control center suggests to direct flight to Lodge's military air base on tiny island of Terceira in the Azores. The Flight 236 was en route to Lodge's and it was 280 kilometers away from the land. It was at 39,000 feet. At 6:13, a fire erupted in the right engine of the aircraft. Upon seeing this, panic spread throughout the aircraft and the clouds of fear swept away the tranquility of passengers who had been peacefully asleep. The captain increases maximum thrust on the engine number 1 to stabilize the aircraft and decreases its altitude from 39,000 feet to 33,000 feet, which was a proper single-engine altitude for the weight of the plane at that time. At 6:26, about 13 minutes later, because of the running on the full thrust, engine number 1 also caught fire. The aircraft was still 130 kilometers away from the Lodge's Air Base. With both the engines down, the Flight 236 was gliding towards Lodge's. Now, the aircraft has descended to 30,000 feet. The descent rate of the plane was about 2,000 feet per minute. The worst-case scenario was that if the aircraft couldn't reach the airport, it would have to land in the ocean. The risk of landing in the water is dangerous in every way. Because even if the passengers survive the impact, they may drown in the water, and if they do not drown in the water, they may die of hypothermia due to cold water. As the altitude was dropping at the rate of 2,000 feet per minute, they had 15 to 20 minutes to reach either the airport or end up in the ocean. When the distance of the plane was 15 kilometers from Terceira Airport, its altitude was 13,000 feet. And normally, at such a distance, the altitude should be around 3,000 feet. To lower its altitude, Captain decided to perform a 360-degree turn right there. Once the turn was completed, the distance from the airport remained the same, while the altitude had dropped to 5,000 feet. This altitude was still high, but not high enough to make another 360-degree rotation. Therefore, the pilot aligned the plane's position with the runway and executed a series of S-turns. Due to the S-turns, the plane's distance from the runway increased and it got more time to lower its altitude. In normal conditions, during landing, flaps are extended to create drag and engine thrust is increased, causing the plane's nose to pitch up. But Flight 236 did not have engine thrust, that's why this landing was very different from normal landing and very dangerous. At 6:45 the plane touched down hard, bounced once. Because the anti-skid and brake modulation systems were inoperative, the 8 main wheels locked up. The tires abraded and fully deflated within 450 feet, and the wheels themselves were worn down to the axle journals during rollout. 14 passengers and 2 crew members had minor injuries, while 2 passengers had serious injuries during the evacuation of the aircraft. When the investigation was done regarding the fuel leakage in the right engine, it was revealed that prior to takeoff in Toronto, the maintenance crew had replaced a part of the engine. But that part belonged to a different plane. Due to loose fitting, it caused vibration which burst the fuel line passing nearby. After this incident, Airbus installed a new system that will allow pilots to detect fuel leakage during flight in the future. A year later, Captain Robert Pish and First Officer Dirk de Jager were honored with the Superior Airmanship Award for performing a dead-stick landing on an Airbus A330. Flight 236 was the first passenger plane in aviation history to hold the record for longest glide time without engine. As we conclude our journey into the enigma of Air Transat Flight 236, one can't help but wonder what other mysteries lie hidden in the clouds.